August 13th, 1944. The air inside the headquarters of the Third Army was thick with the smoke of cigarettes and the electrifying tension of imminent victory. General George S. Patton stood before a massive tactical map of northern France, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines of the front. His forces, moving with a speed that defied logistical logic, had just captured Argentan, a quiet, nondescript town situated exactly 15 miles south of Falaise. To a layman, these were just names on a map. To Patton, they represented the throat of the German army. The opportunity that lay before him was not merely a tactical advantage. It was staggering in its historical magnitude. Over 100,000 German soldiers, the battered remnants of the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, were trapped in a collapsing pocket. They were fighting with their backs against the Allied noose, desperate, disorganized, and vulnerable. Patton knew that his armored columns, the spearhead of the American advance, could bridge that 15-mile gap in a matter of hours. If he gave the order, they would drive north, link up with the British and Canadians, and seal the trap completely. It would be a total annihilation, a canaille for the modern age. Then, the phone rang. It was a sound that would echo through history. On the other end of the line was Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group and Patton's superior. The order he delivered was calm, precise, and utterly devastating to Patton's strategic sensibilities. "Stop where you are," Bradley told him. "Do not advance beyond Argentan." Patton stood frozen, the receiver pressed to his ear, unable to process the absurdity of the command. Bradley was ordering him to halt with the greatest victory of the war within arm's reach. The German 7th Army was broken. Their command structure was fracturing, and their retreat was devolving into chaos. One more push, just a few hours of driving steel tracks over French soil, would destroy them completely. Patton's voice rose, trembling with suppressed rage. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk," he barked. He wasn't joking. In his mind, the hesitation of his allies was inexcusable. He was furious that Bradley, a man he viewed as overly cautious, would shackle him at this decisive moment. But Bradley's order was final. The Third Army would halt at Argentan and wait. They were to wait for the British and Canadian forces advancing slowly, painfully, from the north to close the gap. They were to wait while the Germans poured through the opening, frantically trying to escape the cauldron. Patton hung up the phone with a force that nearly cracked the plastic. He looked at the map again. 15 miles. That was all that separated his forward elements from linking up with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. 15 miles of open country that would remain open for 8 more agonizing days. What followed wasn't just a tactical mistake. It was a strategic disaster of the highest order. It was a blunder that extended the war in Europe, allowed the enemy to live to fight another day, and ultimately cost thousands of American lives in battles that should never have been fought. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must ask, how did this happen? Why, when the enemy was on their knees, did the Allies hesitate? The Falaise pocket didn't form by accident. It was the culmination of weeks of grinding attrition and sudden, explosive maneuver. It was the result of German stubbornness and Allied aggression finally breaking the deadlock. For 6 bloody weeks after D-Day, Allied forces had been stuck in the nightmare of the Normandy hedgerows. This was the Bocage country, an ancient landscape where every field was a fortress bordered by thick, earthen banks and tangled roots. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery fought brutal, World War I-style battles of attrition around the city of Caen, drawing in the bulk of German armor. Meanwhile, American forces under Bradley ground through the Bocage meter by meter, paying for every hedgerow in blood. German forces held every position until it became untenable, fighting with the desperation of men who knew the war was turning against them. Then, on July 25th, the stalemate shattered. Operation Cobra smashed through the German lines at Street Low. Bradley's First Army, led by the aggressive General Lightning Joe Collins, punched a massive hole in the German defenses. Through this breach poured Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, racing east and south across France like a flood. At this critical juncture, Adolf Hitler made the worst decision possible. A rational commander would have ordered a fighting withdrawal to the Seine River, preserving manpower and equipment to establish a new defensive line. But Hitler did not deal in rationality. He dealt in delusions. Instead of retreating, he demanded a counterattack. On August 7th, in Operation Luttich, 4 panzer divisions attacked west toward Mortagne, trying to cut off the American breakout at its base. It was a suicide mission. The attack failed completely within 48 hours, stopped cold by American resistance and devastating Allied air power. But the strategic consequence was profound. The failed Mortain offensive left German forces deep in a salient, their heads stuck in a noose with Allied armies closing in on three sides. British and Canadian forces pressed relentlessly from the north toward Falaise. American forces wheeled around from the south and east. The pocket was forming, and the Germans had walked right into it. By August 12th, the situation inside the pocket was apocalyptic. Over 100,000 German troops from the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a shrinking area between Falaise and Argentan. The only escape route was a narrow gap to the east toward the Seine River. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding German forces in the west, knew the situation was desperate. He could see the maps. He could hear the reports of disintegrating units. His armies needed to escape the pocket immediately or face complete destruction. But Hitler's orders from Rastenburg were rigid. Hold positions, no retreat, continue fighting. Every hour the pocket remained open. More Germans slipped through the net. Every day of delay allowed them to regroup, to salvage equipment, and to establish new defensive lines further east. The opportunity to destroy the German forces in France in a single stroke was slipping away, grain by grain. Patton's Third Army had covered over 200 miles in 2 weeks since becoming operational. His forces had liberated Le Mans, Alençon, and now Argentan. They were positioned perfectly to close the Falaise pocket from the south. The German forces in the pocket were in absolute chaos. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, ruled the skies, destroying vehicles on every road in broad daylight. Artillery hammered German positions constantly, turning the pocket into a churning kill zone. Units were mixed together, command chains were broken, and communication was non-existent. It was a rout waiting to be completed. Major General Wade Hayslip, commanding the XV Corps, had taken Argentan on August 13th with minimal resistance. His reconnaissance units reported a stunning fact. The road to Falaise was lightly defended. The German flank was exposed. The 2nd French Armored Division and the U.S. 5th Armored Division were fueled, armed, and ready to advance immediately. Patton saw the board clearly. If XV Corps pushed north from Argentan while Montgomery's forces pushed south from Caen, they would link up near Falaise and trap the entire German force in a steel cage. It was the classic encirclement maneuver, the Times Kesselschlacht asterisk, that every military strategist since Hannibal had dreamed of executing. The distance was negligible. Argentan to Falaise was 15 miles of open country. Patton's armor could cover that distance in a few hours under normal conditions. Even with scattered German resistance, it would take at most a day or two. The prize was the end of the war in 1944. But there was a problem not of ballistics or geography, but of bureaucracy and politics. The boundary line between Bradley's 12th Army Group and Montgomery's 21st Army Group ran through this exact area. Allied planners, months prior, had drawn the line on a map to prevent American and British forces from accidentally firing on each other. It was a safety measure designed for a static front, not a fluid breakout. Patton didn't care about boundaries drawn on paper by staff officers in London. He cared about destroying the Wehrmacht while it was vulnerable. He told his staff they had an unparalleled opportunity to win the war right here in August 1944. They were staring victory in the face, and they were going to let it slip through their fingers because of coordination problems and political sensitivities. Patton called Bradley and requested permission to advance beyond Argentan toward Falaise. He was willing to accept the risk of encountering Montgomery's forces if it meant closing the pocket. He argued that the tactical situation had changed, that the map lines were obsolete. Omar Bradley faced the most consequential decision of his command. His choice was stark. Let Patton advance and risk a friendly fire disaster and a political row with the British, or halt and wait for Montgomery to close the gap from the north. Bradley was fundamentally a cautious man. He was the GI's general, a man who had spent his career as a staff officer and educator before taking field command in 1943. He valued careful planning, methodical execution, and strict coordination over aggressive improvisation. Patton's request to violate the boundary agreement went against every instinct Bradley possessed. There were legitimate tactical concerns, to be sure. American and British forces operated on different radio frequencies and used different recognition signals. If Patton's armor pushed north while Montgomery's forces pushed south, they might encounter each other in the confusing, smoke-filled landscape of the battlefield. The risk of American Sherman tanks firing on Canadian infantry or British Typhoons striking American columns was real. But the larger concern, the unspoken weight in the room, was political. Montgomery was technically Bradley's equal in the command structure, not his subordinate, though Montgomery often acted as the overall ground commander. The boundary agreement had been negotiated between Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley. Changing it required Montgomery's consent. Bradley had already endured months of friction with the prickly field marshal over command arrangements and resource allocation. Montgomery resented the growing American dominance of the campaign and complained constantly about Eisenhower's broad front strategy. The relationship was tense, fragile, and fraught with ego. If American forces crossed into Montgomery's sector without permission, it would be seen as a deliberate insult, a cowboy maneuver undermining British authority. Montgomery would protest to Churchill. Churchill would complain to Roosevelt. The political fallout could damage the alliance at a critical moment when unity was essential. Bradley made his decision. He ordered Patton to halt at Argentan and hold position. Third Army would not advance beyond the boundary line. Montgomery's forces would be given time to close the gap from the north without interference. It was the politically safe choice. It avoided potential friendly fire incidents. It respected the rigid command structure. It kept Montgomery's pride intact, but it left the escape route open. Patton's response to Bradley's halt order was immediate and furious. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk," he shouted. The comment was classic Patton, aggressive, tactless, and revealing his deep contempt for Montgomery's plodding fighting style. Bradley ignored the provocation and repeated the order: "Hold at Argentan. Do not advance." Patton argued his case with desperation. XV Corps was positioned perfectly. German resistance was minimal. The road to Falaise was open. Every hour of delay allowed more Germans to escape through the gap. The opportunity would never come again. "We are throwing away a victory," he insisted. Bradley's answer remained rooted in caution. Crossing the boundary without Montgomery's permission would create administrative chaos. Better to wait and coordinate properly than rush forward and risk an incident. Patton hung up the phone knowing he had lost the argument. He called his corps commanders and issued the halt order with barely contained rage. Third Army would stop at Argentan and wait for Montgomery to close the pocket from the north. Thousands of American tanks sat idling along the road south of Falaise. Crews shut down their engines and climbed out onto the hulls, removing their helmets in the summer heat. They could hear the rumble of artillery fire in the distance. They could see the black smoke rising from German positions ahead. The road to Falaise was open in front of them, tempting and clear, but they weren't moving. They sat and waited while their officers explained that coordination with Allied forces required patience. The tankers looked north toward the gap and wondered why they were stopping when the enemy was running. Patton watched his staff officers pace the headquarters. The gap between Argentan and Falaise mocked them. 15 miles. That's all it would take. Patton told his staff they were about to make the most terrible mistake of the war. They were going to let the German army escape because they were afraid of upsetting Montgomery's feelings. He wrote in his diary that night that the halt was a terrible mistake. XV Corps could easily advance to Falaise and close the gap completely, he believed. But the order stood, and he was certain, with a grim prophecy, that Montgomery would not close the gap from the north in time. Patton's prediction would prove tragically accurate. While Patton's forces sat at Argentan, engines cold, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was supposed to be advancing south toward Falaise to close the pocket. The advance was led by the 1st Canadian Army under Lieutenant General Henry Crerar, with the British I Corps attached. These were experienced formations that had been fighting since D-Day, but the advance was agonizingly slow. German forces defending the northern shoulder of the pocket were fighting with the ferocity of trapped rats. SS Panzer divisions conducted brilliant fighting withdrawals, contesting every hedgerow, every farmhouse, every crossroads before falling back. The terrain favored the defense perfectly. The countryside around Falaise was bocage, similar to the hedgerows that had stalled the Allied advance in June. Every field was bordered by earthen banks that provided natural fortifications for anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. Montgomery's characteristic caution was evident in the operational tempo. Canadian forces advanced methodically, relying on heavy artillery preparation before each assault to minimize losses. Casualties were kept as low as possible, but progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day. By August 16th, 3 days after Patton had been halted at Argentan, Canadian forces had still not reached Falaise. The town finally fell on August 17th. But even then, the pocket wasn't sealed. The gap east of Falaise toward Chambois remained open. Allied commanders finally recognized the magnitude of the problem. British, Canadian, American, and Polish forces were all converging on the shrinking pocket, but coordination was difficult. Units from different nationalities with different command structures were trying to link up in confusing, smoke-choked terrain. Montgomery later claimed that the deliberate pace was necessary to avoid excessive casualties and maintain proper control of the operation. He argued that trying to close the pocket too quickly would have resulted in chaos. But the slow advance gave German forces precious time, 8 full days, to escape. Between August 13th and August 21st, the Falaise Gap remained partially open. During those 8 days, the German army performed a miracle of survival. Tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped the pocket. The gap itself shifted like a living thing as Allied forces advanced from multiple directions. What started as a 15-mile opening between Argentan and Falaise became a narrower corridor between Chambois and Street Lambert-sur-Dives, but it never closed completely until August 21st. German forces poured through the gap in desperation. It was a scene of utter carnage and panic. Soldiers abandoned their heavy equipment, sabotaging their own tanks and artillery, and fled on foot or in stolen civilian vehicles. Officers organized desperate rearguard actions to hold Allied forces back while the main body escaped. Some units maintained discipline and withdrew in good order, marching in columns. Others dissolved into a mob. Allied air power devastated the German columns. Fighter bombers swooped down like hawks, attacking anything that moved on the roads. Destroyed vehicles created massive traffic jams that stretched for miles. The roads became graveyards of machinery and men. With dead horses rotting in the August heat and burning equipment filling the air with acrid black smoke, the atmosphere was hellish. Pilots flying missions over the pocket reported they could smell the carnage from thousands of feet in the air, the sickening stench of death mixed with burning rubber and fuel. Drivers in the columns had to steer around wreckage because the roads were completely blocked. Some ran over bodies and equipment because there was no other way forward. The carnage was so intense that German soldiers abandoned perfectly good vehicles just to escape on foot through the fields and forests. The alternative was sitting in a stalled column, a sitting duck waiting for the next strafing run. Movement meant death from above. Staying still meant certain destruction from the closing walls of the pocket, but the Germans kept coming. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced the disgraced von Klug on August 17th, brought a ruthless energy to the retreat. He ordered every available unit to fight its way east toward the Seine. The alternative was surrender or annihilation. Most chose to run through the corridor of death, rather than wait in the pocket to be captured. The climax of the closure came not from the Americans or British, but from the Poles. The Polish 1st Armored Division, fighting under the Canadians, seized a critical ridge known as Mont Ormel, or the Mace Maxuga, which overlooked the escape route. For 2 days, they held their position against desperate German waves, trying to break out, and SS units trying to break in to rescue their comrades. Isolated and running out of ammunition, the Poles sealed the bottle. American forces from Patton's army finally linked up with them at Street Lambert on August 19th. The gap was finally closing, but it wasn't completely sealed until August 21st, when all organized German resistance in the pocket ended. By then, it was too late. A significant portion of the trapped force had escaped. The question that has haunted historians for 80 years is how many? The exact number of German soldiers who escaped the Falaise pocket has been debated endlessly. The fog of war makes precise counts impossible. Allied forces captured approximately 50,000 German prisoners inside the pocket. They counted roughly 10,000 German dead, destroyed vehicles numbered in the thousands. The material losses were staggering. The German 7th Army effectively lost all its heavy equipment. But German records suggest that between 20,000 and 50,000 soldiers escaped the encirclement. These weren't just random conscripts, they were experienced combat veterans from elite formations. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich got out. Survivors from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler escaped. Parts of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend made it through the fire. These were the best trained, most fanatical units in the German army. Regular Wehrmacht divisions also escaped in significant numbers. The 116th Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and the elite Panzer Lehr all had survivors who reached the Seine and continued retreating east toward Germany. These men were the repository of the German army's institutional memory. They were the core of experienced soldiers who could be used to rebuild shattered divisions. They were officers who knew how to train replacements in weeks rather than months. They were NCOs who understood combined arms tactics and wouldn't panic under fire. Field Marshal Model used these survivors to form new defensive lines along the Siegfried Line and the German border. The soldiers who escaped Falaise became the nucleus of the divisions that would fight the Battle of the Bulge 4 months later. The connection is direct and chilling. The 1st SS Panzer Division would spearhead the Ardennes offensive. The 12th SS Panzer Division would fight in the northern sector. The 2nd SS Panzer Division would participate in the southern attacks. The 116th Panzer Division would be committed to exploitation operations. All of them had veterans who had escaped through the Falaise Gap. All of them would kill Americans in December. Fast forward to December 16, 1944. German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front through the snow-covered Ardennes forest. Over 200,000 German troops hit weakly defended American positions with complete surprise. The offensive was spearheaded by the very SS Panzer divisions that had escaped the Falaise pocket 4 months earlier. The 1st SS Panzer Division led the advance in the northern sector, committing the Malmedy massacre. The 12th SS supported them with ruthless efficiency. These divisions had been rebuilt with new tanks and fresh troops, but their heart and brain were the veterans from Normandy. American forces in the Ardennes suffered over 19,000 killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Total casualties exceeded 80,000. It was the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army fought in the European theater. Many of those Americans died fighting German veterans who should have been captured or killed at Falaise. The SS officers who planned small unit tactics in the snow of the Bulge had learned their craft fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy. The panzer crews who destroyed American Shermans in Belgium had escaped through the gap in August. The connection was undeniable. Every German soldier who escaped Falaise was potentially available to fight again. Not all of them made it to the Bulge. Some were killed in the fighting retreat to Germany or assigned to the Eastern Front. But enough survived to form effective combat units that nearly turned the tide of the war. Patton recognized this with bitter clarity during the Bulge. His Third Army was called north from Lorraine to perform a miraculous 90-degree turn and relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. As he fought his way through stiff German resistance, he noted in his diary that many of the units opposing him were formations that had escaped Falaise. He wrote that he had told his superiors they should have closed that gap in August. Now, they were paying for that hesitation in American blood. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, which fought at Falaise and escaped through the gap, was one of the divisions Patton's forces encountered trying to relieve Bastogne. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand, and casualties were heavy on both sides. Years later, Bradley admitted the decision to halt Patton at Argentan was probably a mistake. In his memoirs, he wrote that closing the gap earlier might have shortened the war and saved lives. But he never acknowledged specifically how many lives. Bradley defended his halt order publicly by citing friendly fire risks. He argued that American and British forces converging on the same objective with different radio frequencies could shoot each other by mistake. The explanation sounded reasonable to the public. But the friendly fire excuse didn't hold up under professional scrutiny. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front regularly closed massive encirclements from multiple directions without excessive friendly fire incidents. Proper coordination, flares, radio discipline, and map lines could manage the risk. The events of August 19th proved the point. When American and Polish forces finally linked up at Chambois to close the gap, there were no friendly fire disasters. Units from different armies coordinated successfully despite the utter confusion of combat. Bradley knew the friendly fire excuse was thin. In his 1951 memoir Times, A Soldier's Story**, he acknowledged the halt order was likely an error in judgment. He admitted the gap should have been closed sooner. Yet, he stopped short of saying how many American lives the delay cost. What Bradley never admitted in print was that the decision was fundamentally about command relationships, not tactical risks. He had chosen to avoid a confrontation with Montgomery over boundary violations. He had prioritized alliance harmony over the ruthless opportunity to destroy the German army in France. Patton understood this immediately. His supporters understood it. Military historians would debate it for decades. But the soldiers who died in the freezing woods of the Ardennes never got to weigh in on whether protecting Montgomery's pride was worth their lives. The German forces that escaped Falaise retreated to the Seine River, then back to the Siegfried Line along the German border. They formed the core of the German defense that held Allied forces through the miserable fall and winter of 1944. The fighting in September and October 1944 was some of the bloodiest and most frustrating of the war. American forces attacked the Siegfried Line at Aachen and in the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest. Casualties were staggering for minimal gains. The German defenders fought with skill and determination. Many of those defenders were veterans of Normandy who had escaped through the Falaise Gap. They knew Allied tactics. They had been fighting British and American forces since June. They were experienced, battle-hardened soldiers who wouldn't break easily. If the Falaise pocket had been closed completely in mid-August, those veterans would have been removed from the German order of battle. The Siegfried Line would have been defended by hastily organized replacement units, old men, and boys without combat experience. The Allied advance might have reached the Rhine in 1944 instead of 1945. The war might have ended by Christmas, but that is speculation. What actually happened is that Allied forces ground slowly through German defenses at enormous cost. The war in Europe continued for 9 more months. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died on both sides in battles that might have been avoided. Patton believed until his death that the Falaise Gap failure extended the war by 6 months. He argued that closing the pocket in August would have allowed Allied forces to reach Germany before German defenses could be reorganized. Whether he was right is unknowable, a ghost of history. But the decision to halt at Argentan had consequences that rippled through the fall and winter campaigns like a shockwave. The Germans who escaped became the soldiers who defended every river, every town, every defensive position on the way to Berlin. Bradley carried the weight of his decision for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, he acknowledged the gap should have been closed sooner. He admitted the halt order was probably wrong, but he never quantified the cost. That calculation is impossible to make with precision. The numbers include not just the Bulge, but the grinding autumn battles that preceded it. The total runs into the tens of thousands when you count all the casualties from September through December fighting German forces that should have been captured or killed at Falaise. Every one of those deaths had a name. Every one of those casualties was a father, a son, or a brother who might have come home if a telephone call on August 13th, 1944, had gone differently. It serves as a grim reminder that in war, caution can be just as deadly as recklessness, and the price of coalition politics is often paid in blood.